Well, hello and welcome to a special edition of the Lamppost Listener. My name is Daniel.
I'm Phil.
And this is a podcast where we usually talk about the Chronicles of Narnia, but instead today we're going to be talking all about just C.S. Lewis in general.
That's correct. We are at a symposium, a collection of the minds, if you will.
Yes, correct, Phil. We are
There's
here.
no coincidence that we are here.
All the minds are actually out at the conference somewhere else, and
That's
Phil
right.
and I are in our hotel room being ourselves. So we are, if you haven't noticed or heard us talk about on the show, we are in Montreat, North Carolina at the C.S. Lewis Influence and Relevance Today International Symposium. We just finished day one of the conference, and we thought it'd be just a treat for y'all to be able to hear some of the things we've learned about today and been able to experience. And so here we are.
That's right. What was your initial thoughts? What was your favorite thing you saw today?
So obviously, I really enjoyed this interview with Douglas Gresham, C.S. Lewis's stepson. There were so many just interesting little tidbits to take away from that. Some of them were serious, and some of them were trivial and just.
He is a natural storyteller as well. He has a lot of good stories.
Yes, he has so many good stories. One of the things that I took away just from the very beginning, he just came at it. He did not beat around the bush or anything, and he said, Lewis's works, or Jack's works will last forever because he tells the truth. He told the truth.
He said that right off the bat, and I think that is a very good way to categorize what C.S. Lewis was writing. It was truth.
Yeah, I loved also hearing about the home of Joy Davidman and Lewis there at the Kilns, and he just talked about it being full of laughter and joy. He talked about his relationship with Lewis and just a really emotional moment as he shared that as he came home the day that his mother passed away, he said that Lewis was there in, I guess, the living room with his hand on the mantle, and Douglas walks in and says, what are we going to do now, Jack? And Lewis's response is, I guess we'll have to carry on. And it's one of those things. One, just it was a really just a powerful moment. Just you could hear the emotion in his voice sharing these things. And I'm just so thankful that he's so willing to just let us into so much of his personal life. And he shares it so willingly. Douglas Gresham does. And I thought that was really nice. And then it's also so interesting in my mind, I know that C.S. Lewis exists, right? Obviously. But I don't think I've ever met somebody or talked to somebody who had a relationship with them. And it's the same thing if you ever meet somebody famous, right?
Yeah.
Where all of a sudden it's like, whoa, Lewis was a real man. And I know that sounds a little silly to say it, right? But just being like, oh, he was not just an author, right? Because that's what he is to me. He's an author. He's a thinker. He's like, oh, he was someone's stepfather. He was a husband. Because that's not how I experienced Lewis, right? He's not my dad.
He's
he's
an
not my
author
spouse.
from a significant amount of time ago.
Exactly. And so it just is so interesting to hear Douglas talk about him in these other roles, which obviously were very important roles in his life, maybe even more important, obviously, than his writing.
Another cool part was Douglas also knew Tolkien and interacted with him.
Yeah.
So once we meet Doug, we'll be 1 degree removed from Tolkien.
And Lewis.
And Lewis.
So are you calling him Doug now?
Oh, yeah. I mean,
He's your buddy. He told us that Lewis swore sometimes. That's one of the worst things.
That was the thing that he thought people would be surprised by. Someone asked him what they would be surprised by.
He said he swore. And so, well, Phil, what stuck out to you?
We saw a really enjoyable one-man play tonight. And what I really enjoyed was the way he spoke to us as if he was Jack. And it takes a little bit of suspension of disbelief, but I found myself within the first 10 minutes, 15 minutes, thinking, this is Lewis. It was like watching C.S. Lewis talk to us. It was almost like he came back just for a little bit, just to speak with us and show us what it was like to be him. And he did a great job of weaving in parts of the Screw Tape Letters and parts of other books that he's written, and even some of the poetry that he had done.
Yeah.
And I knew about the Screw Tape Letters because I read it in high school, and I studied it enough that I remembered certain parts when they were talking about it. But I really enjoyed the poetry that I hadn't heard before. And he tied it all he tied it together so well, but he also was a very engaging actor. And I think that he did a really good job communicating more about Lewis. And it was great also to hear little things that we had just learned about from other speakers, little facts that had been dropped.
Can you think of one?
Yeah, one of the things that stood out to me was we heard this fact from another speaker earlier that C.S. Lewis knew that there was a God and he knew that Jesus was around, but he was not quite convinced, this is early on, that Jesus was the Son of God. And he said that he got into a motorcycle sidecar to ride along to the zoo with some family members in another car. And when he got in the sidecar, he didn't believe that Jesus was the Son of God. And by the end of the ride, he did.
Mm-hmm.
And the joke afterwards was, well, it was because of his driving or something along those lines. And that was incorporated into the play because apparently that's a well-known fact if you're a C.S. Lewis scholar. And it was cool to see there were a couple of things like that throughout the day that I had just learned about Lewis and then were incorporated into that play.
Yeah, it was a really enjoyable production. I really had a good time with it. Another thing I really want us to talk a little bit about is, and one of the lectures we listened to today, it was by Dr. David Downing, who is a professor at Wheaton College, and he was looking at the lasting influence of Mere Christianity and looking at the BBC radio talks that, were the impetus for that entire book, obviously. And I want to just talk through a couple of my notes here that I really haven't had time to process. So I guess you'll be hearing, Phil, my very raw thoughts. That as Downing talked about the kind of lasting vitality that this book has had, he mentioned a couple of things that I think I've known as a reader of Lewis for a long time, but not had the words to describe. Oh, what is it that I love so much about his writing? Here's one of the things he said. He said that Lewis has empathy through the page. He shows the readers empathy through the page. He talks about that he often anticipates audience reactions, and sometimes comes out as bluntly as saying, many of you might be thinking this, and so here's your answer. And it's not this kind of prideful intelligence of like, here, I know some of you guys just don't get this, so let me give it. But it's no, like, hey, like, I know where you've been, or I know how you're feeling because I feel that now, and let me walk with you in that. And so this idea of this empathy through the page was something that I think we see in a lot of Lewis's apologetic writing, which is why he's so good at this. But I'd never thought of it through that lens. Did that part stick out to you at all?
It did. It also reminded me of earlier when we heard about the three-legged stool. So Aristotle's three-legged stool were the three components of a solid argument. Is that a good way to summarize that?
Yeah, it's Aristotle's kind of ideas of persuasion, his kind of threefold idea of persuasion.
Yeah, so pathos, logos, and ethos. Pathos being what the audience needs, wants, and having an understanding of that. And that's the empathy that you were talking about. Logos, and having a mind deeply involved in reason is how they put it. And so, going pretty deep and logically. And then ethos, just being a winsome, likable person or having that persona. And as this gentleman, Donald King, was talking about this, he broke down how Lewis did that. And he gave specific examples, which were great, but I didn't even need the examples because I remembered them as soon as he was outlining pathos, logos, and ethos. Because I had read Mere Christianity and I knew exactly what he was talking about. And I'm curious if C.S. Lewis did that naturally or if he systematically did that. Either way, it worked really well.
Yeah. Could you think of any examples for pathos, logos, and ethos?
The winsome, likable persona.
When it comes to like ethos?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I think that just anything he writes, the asides to the reader in Narnia, would be an example of that happening in his regular narration. But I think that just the way he talks, it seems like it's him talking to you at a fireside chat, just in a prepared way. In Mere Christianity, which was originally talks over the radio. So they were, in a way, a fireside chat.
So yeah, and in the same kind of vein as Aristotle's triad of persuasion, I really enjoyed the way that Dr. King focused in on Lewis's ability to combine reason with imagination Dr. King talked about how he integrated those two things and how they work together to inform each other. And then he spoke to the way that this works in The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. And I really felt this in my own personal reading of that book. And I think I might have talked about it, back when we covered it on the show. But, whenever I get to chapter 14, the triumph of the witch, and Aslan's off, and he's being killed by the ogres and the hags and all of the witch's friends. And so I made the connection about how in my own life, a lot of times I often have had a more emotional response to that chapter than I have to reading the actual gospel accounts. And it's not that I want to be clear. I'm not saying that I don't at all have an emotional connection to them, because obviously I do. There's scripture, but that this is what Don King says. He says sometimes the obligation to feel freezes the feeling. And I really related to that. And I think Lewis was really onto something by contextualizing this story in both imagination and reason. And so I thought that was a really cool thing.
What I really enjoyed about that is how he basically said why we're still reading Lewis today.
Mm-hmm.
It's because these stories are important, but they also point to something even more important.
Yeah, I think that's really what Lewis was onto, was something that's deeply profound, which is why two, nerds are down in North Carolina right now talking about Lewis over 50 years after he passed away.
And I think we're going to find even more evidence of that over the next couple of days,
mm-hmm.
because the kind of the big question here is, why are we still talking about Lewis?
Exactly.
There are a lot of authors from around the same time period that we're not talking about, and lots of reasons for that. But I think there's some very popular authors in particular that we don't talk about anymore.
Mm-hmm.
And I think people can kind of be a flash in the pan, but for some reason we're still talking about Lewis. There are almost 500 people, or over 500 people, here at a conference about C.S. Lewis. And I think we're going to find out more and more about why that is.
Well, yeah, I mean, we can just see that from all of our incredible listeners, right? I mean, when you and I started this, I guess it was probably about 2 years ago, actually, that we started thinking about this happening. And the big question was like, we're going to make sure we have a lot of fun, because we didn't think anybody was going to listen. Like I think we said, if we have 100 downloads in the first, 6 months, we'll be happy. And of course, this has more than exceeded our expectations.
Right. And we blew past that number, but I don't think it was necessarily because people wanted to hear you and I talk.
No, not at all. It was in spite of us.
It was because of the content. There are some true Narnia there may be people from Narnia listening, but there are true Narnia fans out there who are looking for more ways to find people who like Narnia.
And unfortunately, they're stuck with us because there just isn't, But no, I'm being facetious, but you're right that there's this hungering for Lewis, and there's something that's still speaking to so many of us. And it's cool to see people here of all ages that it's speaking to.
And it's not just the people here; it's hearing the statistics about how many people are still reading Narnia in other countries, and how many copies have been sold. And it's it's hard to tell when you're comparing it to even bigger numbers that are out today, because more stuff's available. But the fact that all of his books are still in print, that's incredible.
Yeah. And one last thing to wrap us up, because I know we're running out of time here, is I was really just taken aback by what a pleasure it is to read the Chronicles of Narnia and be able to do this podcast, especially because, so many people here are scholars and academics, and we're the ones reading the kids' book, but what's beautiful about that is that Lewis is such a great author, and his adult work are so good, and for some people, it's so cool. And one of the things we were doing is we meet new people today. We're asking, what's the first book you read? So many people like Narnia.
Yeah.
It's like it's this great entry point into so much other good work. And people said, oh, and I started with Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, and then I ended up with Mere Christianity, and then I got into, maybe the Abolition of Man, and then I found Chesterton, and I found McDonald, and then and then maybe you went off as like I really liked Mere Christianity, and I picked up N.T. Wright or J.I. Packer or John Stott, and so it's great to hear that there's this imaginative part of the Chronicles of Narnia, right, that opens the doorway into something so much bigger. And we don't have all the time to break down all the allegories that are in that, and the beautiful metaphor that exists within that. But it does make me just love what we get to do.
Right, and it's not just the Narnia books. I'm really excited to go back and read Mere Christianity again and look at some of these other books that I haven't heard of, because I only heard a few of the main ones growing up, and now I'm aware of all these other ones, and it sounds like he's done quite a bit more than I knew about, and now I get to learn.
Yeah, so that about wraps us up here for this first day here at the conference. Again, we'll be back with regular episodes next Wednesday, and maybe we'll find some more time to record here. We got an even busier day tomorrow, so we'll see what happens.
Yeah.
All right, but if not, you'll definitely hear from us next Wednesday with Chapter 4 of The Voyage of the Dawn Treader.